Names. Names on cenotaphs, names on plaques hanging in churches or schools, names on tombstones, names listed in newspapers. 2 years ago, researchers for the Kenora Great War Project began gathering names of individuals who had served in World War I and who had lived in Kenora, Keewatin, or Reddit at some point in their lives. To date, we have 1,351 names on our list, 179 soldiers who were killed in action, and 1,172 who returned. Who were these people? What is the story of their family, their service, their life? To date, our research team has completed just over 500 soldier biographies. And this morning, I'll share excerpts from a few of these. First up is the story of a soldier that journeyed overseas with the first contingent that Lorene described. When the First World War started, Frank Stanley Iriam was one of the early volunteers. He trained with the 98th Regiment in Kenora and then enlisted with the 8th Battalion CEF at Valcartier. When he arrived in France with his unit, his work as a sniper and a scout began almost immediately. Nights were spent patrolling no man's land, and days were used for observation, map making, and sniping. Scouts also served as runners to deliver messages and as guides to bring battalions in and out of the trenches. Frank was gassed in the April of 1915 and spent over a month recuperating in hospitals in France. He had a close call during one operation in the Somme offensive in September 1916, when he was buried for several hours by the explosion of an artillery shell. Early in 1917, in preparation for the attack on Vimy Ridge, massive amounts of munitions arrived behind the lines, and for a few weeks before the battle, Frank was detailed to attach detonators to the stockpile of bombs, shells, and grenades. In August 1917, he was at the Battle of Hill 70, which he called a raging, roaring tumult of slaughter, the like of which has been seldom seen. Just 2 months later, he was in the Ypres salient for the assault on Passchendaele, where artillery shells and heavy rains had turned the battlefield into a wasteland of mud, swamp, and water-filled shell holes. By the time the operation ended, there were 15,000 Canadian casualties, and Frank spent several days as a stretcher bearer carrying out the wounded. In August 1918, during a battle near Almans in France, Frank himself was wounded. He was in an open field that was being raked by machine gun fire when he was hit by a bullet, suffering a severe wound to his left arm. He was evacuated to Rouen and from there to England, where he spent 9 months recovering in 2 hospitals and a convalescent center. On the 16th of September 1919, 5 long years after enlisting, he was discharged with the rank of Lance Sergeant. Frank returned to Kenora and to his job at the CPR. In the 1920s and 30s, Frank recorded his war experiences in a manuscript that he wanted published after his death. His son Glenn collected the papers and had them published in 2008. The book is called In the Trenches, 1914 to 1918. Next, we'll hear about a flight lieutenant in the Royal Flying Corps. George Raymond Carmichael went overseas with the 94th Battalion under Colonel Machin, but once in England, he was transferred to the Royal Flying Corps. George trained in Scotland, and he flew reconnaissance missions in France and Belgium. In September 1917, he narrowly missed being killed when his plane was attacked by German fighters. His observer was wounded, and the plane was riddled with bullets. But George escaped physical injury and was able to land safely in France. After the incident, he was granted 3 months' leave in Canada. He arrived home in October 1917, and for his remaining months of service, he was based in Toronto with the Royal Flying Corps. And now for a story from the Navy. The year was 1917, and Halifax, like the rest of the world, was fully embroiled in the First World War. Serving as the assembly and departure point for transatlantic convoys, carrying supplies and soldiers to the war effort overseas, the small city was quickly evolving into a world-class port and major base of naval operations. Kenorah's Arthur Challoner had recently joined the Royal Canadian Navy and was on a depot ship, the HMS Niobe in Halifax Harbor. It was December 6th, and he was witness to the Halifax explosion. A French munition ship taking explosive materials to France, the SS Mont Blanc, collided with a Belgian relief ship, the SS Imo. Art's personal account of this tragedy was described in a letter he sent to his sister Adelaide. I will read the portion of the letter that begins after the two ships collided. About 200 or 300 of us ran up on the forward main deck to watch the fire, which by this time was raging pretty bad in the forward part of the Mont Blanc. We watched for about 15 minutes and were laughing and joking about someone who was talking about spontaneous combustion, when there was the most deafening roar and the whole dockyard seemed to lift to the sky amidst a great blaze of fire and smoke and bits of the ship. It was so great that we were all swept back, or I should say carried, or better still thrown, for I landed about 25 feet from where I'd been standing. When we landed on the deck, we were just a mass of wriggling men, and the sky was all dark as if a dreadful storm was on. When we could get free of the mass of ourselves, we crawled on hands and knees to any place of cover we could find, for by this time the pieces of the Mont Blanc were falling on the decks like hail, only some larger and thicker. I crawled in behind the bridge, close to the forward mast, and held a big board over my head, while boards from the wrecked portion of the superstructure and all wooden parts of our own ship were hitting us on the back. The whole of the Niobe was wrecked, but none of the funnels or smokestacks fell, or we would have got ours. This lasted about a couple of minutes, and then a great wave came caused by the explosion and rocked the ships so that she broke her anchor chains, which set us adrift. They soon got us tied up again, but there had been a lot of the fellows pretty badly cut and bruised. There were quite a few had been blown overboard, and some of them never got out alive. As a postscript, the devastating explosion killed 2,000 people on the ships and on shore, and wounded 9,000. Halifax was reduced to ruins and debris. Lorraine mentioned the importance of letters sent and received during World War I. This one attempts to describe the war to a child. Sidney Charles Wilcox was serving in France with the 12th Battalion Canadian Railway Troops in June of 1917 when he sent this letter to his 6-year-old daughter Gertrude. My own dear little Gertrude, I'm very sorry I cannot be with you for your birthday, but hope you will have a very happy one and many, many more to come. This is a funny country now. There are no little children to be seen. In fact, no one at all but soldiers. There are no cows or chickens or ducks, and all the houses have been broken down like a house of cards when you touch it. There are lots of horses and mules because the soldiers use them. They are looking full now, as there's lots of green grass for them to eat. But in the winter and spring, they were awful-looking creatures, all covered with mud, and some of them had very little hair on them and looked like camels, all heads and feet and ribs and cakey-looking skin. There are lots of balloons near here, which look like elephants without legs when they're on the ground. They go way up in the air tied to a cable, and 1 or 2 men sit in a basket which hangs underneath them. These men have spyglasses and watch what the Germans are doing and telephone to the men down below, and they tell the artillery where to shoot. We have been working at night and go out bumpity-bump on an old flat car as soon as it gets dark, and the train comes back for us before it gets light. But tomorrow, my company is starting to work in the daytime, and we won't have to go so far up, and we'll be able to go to sleep when other good people do. There are larks here that fly way up in the air and sing very nicely, and every here and there in the fields are bunches of bright red poppies, like the ones that grow in the garden at home. Now, Gertrude, I know you're going to keep on being a good little girl and be kind and generous to your brother Charlie and do what Mummy says. I hope to be home with you before your next birthday. But this Fritz is an awfully bad chap and needs a good spanking to make him remember his manners. But we will get him fixed up before long, and then there will be whole shiploads of daddies coming back to their homes, and won't we have a fine time then? Give Mummy and Charlie a great big hug from Daddy, and with lots of kisses for my little Gertrude, your ever-loving Daddy. Sidney Wilcox did survive the war and returned to his family. We discovered that on our Kenora Great War Project list names of several soldiers who had been prisoners of war. One of them was Harry Hives, who served with the 78th Battalion in Belgium and France. On the night of 28 October 1916, Harry's unit was in the front lines near Albert, France. He was in a patrol that had been detailed to obtain information about German activities. His patrol went missing, and in December 1916, Harry was unofficially reported as a prisoner of war. Harry's service record shows that over the next 2 years, he was moved between 4 different German prisoner of war camps. The armistice ended hostilities on the 11th of November 1918, and about 4 weeks later, Harry was back in England. He returned to Kenora and got to enjoy the happiness of a home and family. However, 179 of Kenora's soldiers did not return from their duty in Europe. One of them, George Ross Thompson, known as Smokey, served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry until 28 September 1918, just 44 days before armistice was signed. Sergeant George Thompson was killed by machine gun fire as his unit was advancing towards the village of Tilloy. He was buried in Crest Cemetery in the village of Fontaine-Notre-Dame in France. For 80 years, George's grave was unlike most others. His marker read simply, Sergeant Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, along with the dates of his death. However, in 1998, after extensive research, the grave was identified as that of Sergeant George Ross Thompson. His relatives were located and told about the findings, and they chose the wording for the bottom of his new grave marker, in remembrance of the sacrifice made for the freedoms enjoyed today. A memorial service was held at Crest Cemetery, and with his nephew and Princess Patricia members in attendance, Sergeant Thompson's grave was reconsecrated, and the last post and revelry played in his honor. The name of Moses Oliver is carved on this monument in Lake of the Woods Cemetery. Lieutenant Moses Oliver served with the 44th Battalion and was killed by a flamethrower in France in May of 1917. A Flammenwerfer was a terrifying anti-personnel weapon that could throw a flame of burning oil more than 15 meters. The chaplain of Moses' battalion provided this graphic account of his death. This part of the front was Oliver's charge, in Oliver's charge. The men broke before the strange and terrible fire. Oliver had no time for seeking advice. Well, he knew the importance of that bit of trench, what its loss would mean, what effect a small breach there would have on the fortunes of the day. He knew not how to meet it, but he knew the enemy must be held back. What he could do, he did. Rallying his men with his revolver and a supply of bombs without a moment's hesitation, he led the way. The fire struck him full and square. His charred trunk fell on the instant like the wings of a moth in a candle flame. In the thick of battle, the work of Moses Oliver was finished. From the cenotaph in Kenora comes the name of Private David Peters. He enlisted when he was 17 and died of his wounds at Passchendaele when he was 18. To give a sense of the grief felt by David's family, I will read an in memoriam they placed in the Minor News. With courage high, he bade goodbye to all he held so dear. No dread showed in his steadfast eye. His warm heart held no fear. His warfare's o'er, his battles fought, his victory won, though dearly bought. His fresh young life could not be saved. He sleeps now in a soldier's grave. Had I but one last fond look into your loving face, or had I only got the chance to kneel down in that place, to hold the hand of my dear boy while your life's blood ebbed away, my heart would not have felt so much the tears I shed today. David is buried in Oxford Road Cemetery in Belgium. Of our soldiers that returned, many had been wounded. The next story tells of the unusual circumstances for one of those soldiers. Kenneth Miller from Keewatin arrived in France with the 48th Highlanders of Canada as the company's piper and member of the battalion pipe band. He was wounded 1 month later when his battalion was training away from the front. Apparently, Kenneth, along with a Sergeant Rose and several others, were returning after an evening out, with Kenneth playing his pipes as they walked along. As they passed one of the battalion billets, the group failed to hear a challenge from a sentry. For some unknown reason, the sentry fired, wounding Sergeant Rose in the hip and Piper Miller in the back with one shot. Officials attributed the incident to a combination of high wind blowing at the time, preventing the group from hearing the sentry's challenge, and the sentry's misunderstanding his orders of what action to take when a challenge went unanswered. I'm wondering if perhaps the sentry just had an aversion to bagpipe music being played at that time of night.
Just once Lisa's done.
Okay.
And then there were the soldiers who came back without any physical injuries, but who had been so badly affected by the horrors they had witnessed that the course of their life was altered forever. John Hennessy Cameron was such a soldier. John was blessed with natural talents in athletics and art, and his early years were marked by his presence on many Kenora hockey teams and rowing crews. John enlisted with the 27th Canadian Infantry Battalion in February 1915. In April of 1916, he was wounded during the confused fighting at St. Eloi. The family account of his wounding has it that an artillery shell suddenly landed right by him and he was buried alive by the flying dirt, until a later shell moved most of the dirt off of him. Dazed and wounded, he began to wander over the battlefield in the general direction of enemy lines, when a couple of comrades were able to spirit him back to safety. John was admitted to hospital in Boulogne, and although he remained in Europe for 3 more years, he would not see duty on the front lines again, being diagnosed as a victim of shell shock. John was discharged from the Army in 1919, and he returned directly to Kenora. The family anxiously received him home, but it was soon apparent that John was a true casualty of war. His experience in France had left him a hollow man. Once a popular, outgoing raconteur, John had come home a retiring, introspective man. Mining was popular in the Lake of the Woods area in the 1920s, and on several occasions, John's father grub-staked him on prospecting missions. This seemed to suit John well. He spent more and more time in lonely pursuits in the quiet, natural environment on the lake and became very knowledgeable of it. At age 41, he married Florence Kelly, and they ran a fishery and trading post on remote Alexandria Island in Lake of the Woods. Among our veterans are those who earned medals of gallantry, the Military Medal, the Military Cross, or the Distinguished Conduct Medal. David Kijik, who had been born in 1896 at Shoal Lake, a First Nations community west of Kenora, enlisted with the 141st Bomos Battalion. Once in England, Kijik was drafted to the 52nd Battalion and sent to France. He joined his new unit in the field while they were at the Battle of Passchendaele. However, it was the following October when David Kijik earned a Distinguished Conduct Medal. We have two accounts of David's heroics from his award citation card. He displayed marked courage and headwork during the attack on enemy positions at Tilloy on 1st October 1918. When his company was held up by heavy fire, he, on his own initiative, ran into the open and, with his Lewis gun at the hip, fired 4 pans into the enemy machine guns. His fire was so effective that a party of the company on the right were able to advance and capture the 4 machine guns together with about 70 prisoners, amongst whom was an enemy officer. He did splendid work. A second account comes from the Winnipeg Free Press, 24th of May, 1941. When their Majesties visited Winnipeg, there came with the Ojibways of Lake of the Woods the gentle giant David Kijik, 6'6" in his moccasins and strong as a bull. He refused to talk or explain how there came to be hidden beneath his aboriginal finery of buckskin fringes and ermine tails a Distinguished Conduct Medal. One of his buddies, Tom Ellicote of Winnipeg, who was with the chief when he won his medal, explained. B Company of 52nd Battalion under Captain Clarence Smith had suffered a horrible strafing. The company was reduced to a mere handful, and even the bandsmen were given rifles and pushed into the front line. At dawn came the order to attack. Less than 50 men were left to go over the top. The chief, an ox of a man for strength, picked up a Lewis gun. I grabbed the ammunition, and he bounded forward. The machine gun emplacement was just ahead. The chief dropped in the mud. From a shell hole, I watched him crawl stealthily forward. With a war whoop on his lips, he rushed the emplacement, stuck the Lewis gun over the top, and let out another whoop. Without a shot, that German gun crew surrendered. Out of the dugout came more Germans till 87 stood there, shivering with upraised hands. Why the chief didn't get the Victoria Cross, I can't figure out. He was the bravest man I knew. After the war, David returned to Shoal Lake, where he worked as a fishing guide and raised a family of 5 children. In the 1930s, he was elected chief, and he served for 3 terms. He was known as a kind and humble man, always willing to help the less fortunate. And he continued to serve his community until his death at age 75. David Kijik School in Shoal Lake is named in his honor. I will finish with one more short excerpt of another medal recipient. Art Sharples, who worked as an electrician in the Kenora paper mill, received a military medal in July of 1919. He had achieved the rank of company sergeant major during World War I and even met King Albert I of Belgium. Art said this of his war experience. Surviving in the war was most times just a matter of sheer luck. Near the end of the war, my buddy George and I were approaching what we figured was a deserted pillbox. George was leading a horse, a pitiful creature he'd picked up along the way. We separated, me on one side, George and the horse on the other. Suddenly, there was an explosion. By the time I checked the pillbox, it was empty, and looked for George, there was no sign of him or the horse. Whether he'd stepped on a landmine or an unexploded shell, I don't know, but he was gone. I was lucky. It could have been me. There are so many more compelling stories we have uncovered in our research, and we hope you will take the time to check them out on the Canadian Great War Project website. Discover the full story of the soldiers mentioned today, or investigate biographies of individuals from that long list of names in our database. We also encourage you to visit the Kenora Great War Project exhibit at the Lake of the Woods Museum this year from August 1st to November 15th. The artifacts, photographs, multimedia displays, and soldier stories that will be presented there are sure to engage you in a unique learning experience and invoke a truly meaningful tribute of remembrance. Thank you.